independent music is simply music that is created from independent record labels, something in opposition or as a corollary or as a breeding ground for, or an incubator, if you would, for the more mainstream popular music industries.
The game I play is a very interesting one. It's imagination in a tight straitjacket.
Because by looking at the stars, we are literally looking back through time.
And as the world gets smaller and more connected, the narrative of freedom is rubbing off on people of different cultures and religions, however remote.
You can't get anywhere if you just copy what somebody told you. You have to be challenging things all the time, challenging everything, and thinking new thoughts and so on.
Well, welcome to another episode of Blab Quotes. It's Ingwa and myself again, and we've got Shams Kadir from the Department of Gender and Cultural Studies at University of Sydney, and today we'll be talking about his research. Welcome, Shams.
Oh.
How are you doing?
Oh, good. Thank you for inviting me, and hello to everyone listening to this.
Awesome. All right, Shams, let's begin with your research journey. So what has inspired you to conduct research in cultural studies and specifically the area of music?
All right. So from a very young age, I was fascinated by the niche-oriented, independent alternative music scenes from around the world. With what access I had living in Bangladesh, where I'm from, in Dhaka city around the 1990s through television, cable television. Internet was not really big at that time, but it started to get big from the 90s in Bangladesh. And then from there, I was interested about their music, like different bands, like from REM to Nirvana. I was interested about their cool factor as well, related with cultural capital and their career trajectories, how they treaded the fine line between, being authentic or being alternative to, being mainstream or being more, part of the popular music industries. So what we call, in music, popular music terms, like authenticity versus selling out, So these things really interested me, and I was also a musician, an active musician from 2001 till 2011 in Dhaka, Bangladesh. I had several bands. One of them was called Bohemian, which was probably my most successful band for some time. Marina knows a few of the members, and so anyways, we were really close, and we did some good gigs around that time. And with this band, what happened is we actually started out being, I think, alternative or more underground. At some point, we sort of crossed over to the mainstream. So my research topic lends a little bit to my lived experiences as well. Finally, music was always my passion. It was a great pastime for me, but my actual profession was being a university lecturer, so I always knew that I had to pursue higher studies, and I did an MA from King's College London, and then I came over to Sydney for an MPhil and then a PhD. So when it was time for me to choose my research topic for my PhD, I just thought that, because I have to work, and everyone, any new PhD students listening to this should understand as well, when you have to work with something for about 4 years, it better be a topic that really interests you, because otherwise it's very tough. So that's my journey. I just thought this is a great chance for me to explore independent music in Australia, in Sydney, where I'm from, and why specifically my thesis is framed around inner west and inner city Sydney, specifically because I would just say two reasons. One reason is even though there is live music plus nighttime economy of central Sydney, which I frame as central Sydney, but there's different scenes all around Sydney, but specifically inner west, inner city Sydney, there is a live music scene, which is part of the nighttime economy here as well. But at the same time, it's not it gets focus, it gets media focus every now and then, but there isn't a lot of academic focus on this. The other reason is the University of Sydney is kind of famous for, or it's always been traditionally a great, it patronizes this kind of cultural development around the campus, around this area of inner city, inner west. That's why I thought that studying independent music of central Sydney might be a great research topic. And here I am in my 4th year of PhD candidature and sort of, still interested. So
That's very cool.
I think that's,
If you're interested in the 4th year.
wow.
Yeah.
Don't allow PhD students to talk. We'll go on and on. That's what it seemed like. Wow. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, I'm done.
So cool. We just want to ask you to elaborate a little bit more on what is independent music, please.
So this was actually one of my most something I really struggled with in the beginning, because there are several narratives from history of popular music industries in the US and the UK and different parts of the world, which contribute to different meanings of independent. And I was quite lost because I felt sometimes I just didn't know what I was really looking at. That's when I realized that it's actually a contested meaning. This term is a contested term, and it's not. It doesn't have stable meanings. It changes. It really depends on several factors and a geographic specific location, and of a different at a different historical and cultural moment. These things mean different things. But canonical texts dictate that independent music is simply music that is created from independent record labels, something in opposition or as a corollary or as a breeding ground for, or an incubator, if you would, for the more mainstream popular music industry. So in a nutshell, that is what is independent music. But of course, in different places around the world and through different conditions, it can mean slightly different things.
So you say it's pretty contextual. So I'm interested now as to how this was different, how the independent music or underground music, first of all, is there a difference between those two terms? And how is it different in the context of Dhaka, Bangladesh, to Sydney, to the inner Sydney scene that you're researching?
Right, okay, so 2 questions. The first one, underground and independent, if you ask me, is there any difference between the terms? I would say that really depends on how you're approaching it. In some ways, through the different types of research that takes place about these kinds of music, is that there might be no different. Just like in Bangladesh, for example, it just got this name underground. Maybe the kids at that time thought it was cool, and that was it. It didn't really. And I actually know about the Pakistani underground scene, and it's different. In Karachi, there's a scene different in different cities as well. Again, in the UK or even in Israel, something which is called underground might not be the same as what we mean in Dhaka or what it means in Pakistan. But that's the one thing. So it depends on how you approach it. But it is meant to be, again, the general definition I just provided for independent music, it's kind of close. It's kind of in opposition, kind of having a sort of marginalization or resistant to the popular music industries, something like that, but different variations of that. And about major differences between an underground scene of Dhaka and maybe the independent music scene of Central Sydney, both of which areas I have worked with my research. So I think the best way to say is that these kinds of alternative music scenes are based on political, historical, a kind of geographic specific location, specific time, like a temporal moment of when this was taking place, as well as economic and socioeconomic. All these kinds of factors really shape what this scene will mean or what this alternative music means in different areas. Specifically, in Dhaka, Bangladesh, for example, it is a scene of upper class kids. Of course, it has disseminated over the years. It has existed for almost 15 years now, maybe almost 2 decades now. So it has disseminated to the more middle class kids as well. And I keep saying kids because it is a big youth thing, even though youth is also a contested term, because there might be people in their mid-30s who might still be termed as youth in cultural studies.
No, it's I think, I agree,
So just saying that, so it is an upper class pastime just because of it's this kind of music, and now coming to the more labor kind of perspective, that this kind of music doesn't really generate much revenue or any revenue at all. It's more of a passion, more of a pastime for many people. And it's similar in Sydney, but just because of the different socioeconomic conditions of Sydney and in Dhaka. In Sydney, I found from my research that it's more a middle-class crowd, people who have jobs, different sorts of jobs, and it can be, and again, as I was doing my research, I found that the definition of a full-time job has changed, because now there are lots of contractual jobs. There might be a series of contractual jobs a person might be undertaking instead of a 9-to-5 full-time office job. So there are different kinds of jobs. That's one thing, but definitely from my findings, it shows that these independent musicians of Central Sydney, they have a job with which they support themselves, and their music is more of a passion, more of a pastime. Sometimes they do get money from it, or sometimes they get recognition. I don't want to say commercial success, I like to say recognition. But, and sometimes they can get quite popular in and around Australia. Sometimes they go for tours in different parts of the world, like Japan or the US. But still, I from my findings, I haven't really seen that there are too many independent musicians who are completely they're completely funded by their own music. They're usually doing some kind of job, if not in the music industry, then in the broader creative industries.
Wow, okay. That sounds like a lot of interesting things going on there. Can you talk a little bit more about how you conducted your research, your methodology, please?
Of course. So I had to do the go through the whole ethics system, because I interviewed people. So I basically conducted semi-formal interviews with 15 research participants who are involved with this independent music scene in different ways. And I basically recorded their interviews, transcribed them, maintained anonymity to using pseudonyms. So all that together, that serves as my primary data, but I also did supplemented it with textual analysis and field notes from participant observations. So like I went to more than 25 gigs in between 2017 and 2018. I conducted these interviews in 2017, and I chose this qualitative methodology because usually in cultural studies, when it's called a phenomenological study. I'm not pronouncing that right, but it's studying a phenomena. And when studying a phenomena, it's usually in cultural studies, interviews are a really useful method. So from there, that's what I use. The other thing I should mention is that because I'm studying a scene which is evolving, which is dynamic, which is moving every day, I actually found that there are some institutions, like different independent radio stations, then some Facebook pages, some websites, some bloggers, and so their blogs, and some YouTube channels, which are really relevant, which kind of mobilizes this independent music scene. So what I did is I followed them, subscribed to them on online social media to see their activities, to see their everyday updates and all that. And that actually became a very important part of my study, just because just with that I could feel that, okay, as I was doing my work, and even though when you're studying a popular culture object, it's always changing, but at least I felt like my work was authentic because it was in touch with what was going on during this time when I was working on my thesis. So in between 2017 to, let's say, early 2019. So I really followed up with them and checked out their updates, and that served as a really important part of my research.
Great. Can you tell us some any interesting things that you found in your findings? Anything that was really exciting, or any space that you found was like, what are some of these spaces that you were conducting your field work in, for example?
Sure. Yeah. So there are a number of venues in these areas of inner west and inner city, which really contribute to the existence of the scene. And the interesting things that I found is like how they respond to different government regulations. But for example, one of the findings, let's say, lockout laws was not a big deal for this music scene particularly. First of all, it's an independent music scene, so these are people who are not professional musicians. And in my thesis, I actually make this distinction: who are the Sydney professional musicians and who are the independent musicians? There are lots of overlaps. It's very difficult to just say two categories, but at least I framed it as a spectrum. You can be on the spectrum where you're on the very professional side. That means you earn money through music, and the other side of the spectrum where you play for fun, you play for even, like, we play regularly, but at the same time, whatever money you get, you give it back to your own music. And besides that, you have a job somewhere, maybe as a TV producer or as a creative graphics designer, something like that. And usually these independent musicians do work in the creative industries in Sydney, so that's another thing. Anyway, so coming back to the point, so some of these venues are really important. Then there's venues like, for example, the Townie, the Newtown Town Hall Hotel.
Okay.
Then different ones in Marrickville, like the Lazy Bones Lounge, and then Mosh Pit. These are really active. And then there's another, because with independent music and with which encompasses like different punk scenes in Sydney, and a lot of other music scenes, like it's called do-it-yourself DIY music scenes around Sydney. They also organize gigs in warehouses.
Yeah.
So this is again, this has a huge history in Sydney. Like there were a lot of in the 70s and 80s, even in the 90s, there were a lot of these warehouse shows, gigs, sometimes discos, which was very common in Sydney. It has kind of died down for many different socioeconomic, sociopolitical reasons at the moment, but at the same time, a lot of these things still happen in Marrickville. That's really interesting. That in the 70s and 80s, areas like Surrey Hills was a very hot spot for this kind of events, but now somehow it has shifted to Marrickville for different reasons. Local laws and all these things do contribute to this. And the other finding, which is really interesting and important for my work, is I found that the Central Sydney independent musicians, they use a lot of digital technologies and social media to kind of do their works. They engage with a lot of DIY activities, which is kind of like they self-manage their music, they self-manage their careers. They're in direct contact with fans, with organizers of gigs and organizers of tours, and they even they record their own music through their laptops, and they sometimes make vinyls just working without any middleman, without any record labels, just getting in contact with vinyl producers, sending their music, getting vinyls made, and then selling it on like e-commerce markets, on online markets, from Bandcamp to like Apple Music and Spotify and all these kind of things. So this whole phenomena I term as digital DIY, because basically in this scene, DIY is a big part, because I found from my research as well that the Central Sydney independent music scene sort of emerged from the Australian punk scenes from the 1970s. Very easy to kind of characterize from bands like Radio Birdman and the Saints, just like they're like termed as the pioneers of this kind of music. But it has changed a lot through the years, but still through the punk scenes of Australia from the 1970s, this independent music scene sort of originated from there. That's why a lot of DIY practices was embedded into this music scene. But now when they're using innovative digital music and communication technologies, it's a very common thing here in the scene right now. I termed it as digital DIY, which is also another interesting finding from my work.
Oh, there's a lot of things in there.
So rich, I think. There's so much depth in that stuff. But we did talk a little bit about the spatial aspect of your study. What we were both interested very much in is the gender aspect of your
I actually wanted to get into that.
Yeah.
But so first of all, let me start from this. From my findings, I found that the scene is sort of split 60-40, with sort of like the males dominating the space. But again, not 50-50, 60-40. And within the scene, I actually asked female members that, do you feel any kind of discrimination, or any different than the male members of the scene? And I found that they actually think that it's a very there's a lot of equality, and there is a lot of inclusiveness in this space. They never found any kind of discrimination. But at the same time, from my textual analysis, I found that in the popular music scene, in the popular music industries of Australia, it is quite male-dominated. There's different institutions like Music NXW and APRA, AMCOS. So I'm going to give you the breakdown of that in a second. It's just these institutions, they're working really hard to address this gender imbalance in the Australian popular music industries. So so much so that even when the federal government, the Scott Morrison government, revealed their recent federal budget for if they are elected again for in the next election, the 2019 election, they actually have about $30 million funding to develop the popular music industries and the nighttime economy of whole of Australia. But they're focusing on a part of that fund will also go to promote women musicians in Australia. So you can see that definitely, since these initiatives are there, definitely there is a gender imbalance here. And that's why, so the two institutions I mentioned was Music NSW, which is state body in NSW. It's a not-for-profit organization, and it's funded by Create NSW. And APRA AMCOS, it represents, APRA means the Australasian Performing Rights Association, and AMCOS stands for the Australasian Mechanical Copyright Owners Society. So basically, these are the people that look after the artists and their royalties and their copyrights. So these organizations are working hard to address the gender imbalance. So coming back to the point, even though the independent music scene of Central Sydney, which is a part of the broader popular music industries of Australia, maybe within this niche-oriented space, it's quite gender equal. The musicians feel that there isn't any discrimination, but definitely within the broader music industries, there is discrimination that the industry and other organizations are working hard to address. In terms of sexuality, I should say that this scene is definitely not a heteronormative scene. There's a lot of LGBTIQ plus involvement here as participants, as audience members, as organizers of gigs and parties, as performers. And there are specific feminist events sometimes, like the Chicks with Pics gig series held at the Townie, I think almost every month. And then there are a lot of different places like the Red Rattler Theatre in Marrickville, which promotes a lot of gay, lesbian performances. And so definitely I should make this clear that even though it might sound like this is a heteronormative scene, it's not. It's quite a very inclusive scene where, again, it's hardly, from my participants, I hardly ever heard of any kind of violence or any kind of abuse that took place in terms of gender or sexuality. I think it's a very safe space and inclusive for everyone.
Oh, that's cool. Okay. That's very rich. And talking about, I know you already include quite a lot of things in there, class, gender, culture. But I was a little bit curious whether race or ethnicity is involved in there as well. Very,
very valid point. So while I was doing this study, another interesting thing was that there was, when I asked my participants about this kind of cultural diversity or ethnicity in this scene, they said that it's definitely not a very, white middle class kind of scene. They mentioned that they're very there's a lot of cultural diversity within the scene, but from the few gigs, and I say few just because it's definitely, I cannot say that I went to all the gigs in between the 2 years that I did my research, but the gigs I went to, I did find that there was a kind of most of the gigs had a more white audience than different ethnicities, which was strange because Sydney is a very multicultural place. So so the scope of my thesis didn't allow me to work on that further. Maybe that's something I'll look up in the future. But at least I found one thing through anecdotal conversations and through other textual analysis that definitely white Australians are more settled to spend more time in these kinds of scenes, which are non-commercial based. They're definitely seen as a pastime, something they can be doing to pass the time and for their own interests, whereas a more immigrant part of Sydney, they are still kind of settling down. They're still trying to, let's say, get the proper job or buy a house or just move on from there, and they're bringing in their own cultural background as well. So they're kind of maybe adding different complexities to this independent music scene. But at this moment, at this time, even though the members say that it's a quite culturally diverse scene, I did find through my own partisan observation that some gigs were more white dominated than other ethnicities.
That's great. I mean, I feel like it sort of resonates with that point you made earlier about how independent is maybe contested, because I'm thinking now, as you mentioned about ethnicity, ghazal nights, for example, in the I don't know, immigrant scene, like, which happens, I think, in Sydney a lot, and I think other cultural musical events that happen a lot. Would that still be considered independent, or is that similar to what this is? Or is that different to what this is? Because that's happening in a different space. It's happening in a different context altogether, and it's got a completely different audience to it.
Right.
Yeah.
I would have to, without giving you a proper answer, I would have to study these phenomena a bit more. But at the same time, I should mention that because my research talks about the inner city, inner west Sydney, which I term as central Sydney, doesn't mean that there's only one music scene in Australia or in Sydney. I think, and in my thesis I acknowledge, but at the same time my scope doesn't really allow me to look at all these other different scenes. But definitely there are different scenes in, let's say, Parramatta, in Campbelltown, in Western Sydney as a whole. It is a whole different thing. And then there are a lot of indigenous music scenes in regional NSW, as well as in areas of pockets of the city like Redfern and all that. So there's definitely other music scenes there. It's just that I have kind of, and you have to do that when you're doing a PhD, kind of just narrow your focus so that you can just specialize on that for that time. But definitely there are other music scenes, and I think ghazal nights, even Bollywood disco,
stuff,
it's a big thing. And so definitely it's there. Now, whether they would be considered independent, just I would just have to look it up more.
No, that's more like, I mean, it's just a thought, right?
No, absolutely, but it does exist. I cannot say that I have to acknowledge that there are different music scenes, just existing together in Sydney.
No, that's great.
Yeah. So can we talk a little bit more about the broader implications or impacts of your research?
And that's something I'm still working on.
Okay.
I still have to convince my future employers that this is important. But so definitely this study will contribute to the growing academic fields of popular music studies or independent alternative music scenes. That's obvious. But more will provide a phenomenological study of the meaning of independence within a contemporary local independent music scene, shaped by several factors which I mentioned, including the geographically and temporally specific historical, political, cultural, social, and economic milieu. And it will provide it will shed more light into related aspects like contemporary creative labor, which I didn't really mention properly, but I did talk about labor a little bit. So then impact of innovative music and communication technologies on music production and consumption practices. It's both. It's like two sides of the coin, like music production, music consumption, and impact of government regulation. So from there, specifically, I want to say that in one of my chapters, I actually try to answer the question: can government regulations or can government policies actually create cultural scenes, or are these scenes better with their creative economy rhetoric and with their inclusivity, with their youth engagement and different kinds of rationale that's behind these kind of government policies to create cultural scenes? Are these better than actually organic cultural scenes that grows around, let's say, Marrickville at the moment? Even though there is so I have to talk about the recent study that was done. So there is a report that came out in November 2018, which is called the NSW Music and Arts Inquiry Report. So in the media, it's sometimes called the Live Music Report. So a report was done, a study was done and presented to the state government that which kind of tried to go deep into the live music scene and the nighttime economy of Sydney. what's the situation now and how to go forward from here. All right, so there are definitely, government policy reports go, there were a lot of findings, there were a lot of recommendations that were made to the state government so that they can work on this. And from there, there are these things came up, like there is something in the policy pipeline for a long time to create cultural hubs in around Marrickville and Sydenham. Okay, and they have specific names for that. It's just I'm just missing that right now. But in some reports, it's called the Off-Broadway Project. If you just look that up on Google, you'll find more information. But it basically talks about creating through government policies cultural hubs, creative hubs on Parramatta Road, all throughout to all the way to Marrickville and Sydenham. But it hasn't really got the proper backing to actually happen yet. But at the same time, when I was taking interviews, different musicians from Central Sydney, they said that there was a kind of a cultural hub around Blackwire Records. Okay, Blackwire Records, which is closed now. It was a record shop on Parramatta Road. It was famous not only because it was just a record shop, it was also a space where local musicians got together. It was also a small venue. So that's how these things work. Usually there's a bar, there's a venue, and there's a shop, a record shop as well. And that's how these kind of music scenes originated anyway in the US and in the UK, through record shops and through record labels and all that anyway. So Blackwire Records used to run as a volunteer specific thing. Only volunteers used to work, and it was not for profit. At the moment, this record shop and the cultural scene around it has completely shut down, mainly because the owners could not compete with the high rent that was there, and the different kinds of real estate developers that wanted to make more homes in that area. So I have drifted from the point, but main point is like in one of my chapters, for example, I'm looking at does this creative economy rhetoric actually work? These kinds of government regulations, when they intervene and they try to make cultural scenes or artist creative hubs, does it work? Or what about the organically created cultural scenes, music scenes and arts hubs that are already there in place? These musicians that I talked with, definitely they're a bit skeptical of these kind of creative economy rhetoric, because they just don't trust the kind of rationale that's behind them. And they would love it if these organically created scenes were kind of supported by government regulations, maybe given funding and all that. But then this debate goes on. There's a whole lot there. But and finally, again, coming back to the broader implication, this is just one side where my study could kind of shed more light into these aspects. The other thing is, I also recently found that studying the new meanings or different meanings of independence or being independent in a music scene might be transferable to other popular cultural objects. Like I'm talking about, when it could be a tool for analysis when studying independent wrestling, independent films, independent TV shows, through different streaming sites and through YouTube. All these kinds of different kinds of shows are coming up now, and independent comics as well. So there's actually some aspects which can be quite directly transferable. So maybe that might be some future research directions.
That's amazing. No, there's so much scope here. Well, we've come to the end of this really rich discussion. I think it's been so great.
I think I have blabbed too much.
No, blabbing is the whole point.
That's very cool.
No, it's been so great. I actually would love to continue this conversation. Shams Bhai. I actually call Shams Bhai. Normally
right.
I'm so used
Marina Bhabi, but it's okay. We'll leave our South Asian identities behind for now.
All right. No, thanks for coming to
Thank
Blab
you so
Codes.
much.
Thanks for your time. And we wish you all the best for your research.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Hey, did you like this episode? If so, will you head over to iTunes and rate and review us, like our Facebook and Twitter pages, as well as subscribe to our YouTube channel. What will help us the most is if you share this episode with a friend and spread the good news.